Have you ever found yourself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling in the quiet hours of the night, while your mind refuses to stay silent? Thoughts racing like restless waves, worries about tomorrow, regrets from yesterday, an endless stream of questions with no real answers. And yet everything around you is still. No one's chasing you. No war is raging outside your window, but inside your mind it feels like a storm. It's strange, isn't it? How in a world where we have more comforts, more technology, more opportunities than ever before, so many of us feel exhausted, overwhelmed, and lost. It's a quiet kind of suffering, invisible to others, but heavy to carry. You might call it anxiety, stress, burnout, overthinking. The Buddhists have a word for it too. They call it dukkha, a subtle, persistent dissatisfaction that clings to the human experience. It's the reason you can be surrounded by friends and still feel lonely. Why you can achieve every goal you set and still feel incomplete. Why, no matter how much you distract yourself, the ache always finds a way back to you. The real battle of life is not the one fought against others. It's the one fought within, between the restless voices that pull us in 1,000 directions, and the quiet truth that peace was never something to be found outside of ourselves. You see, most people spend their whole lives chasing after things, believing, if I can just get this, or become that, or be loved by them, I'll finally be at peace. But peace isn't a destination. It isn't a reward waiting at the finish line. It's a way of being, a state of mind. And like any skill, it can be learned, cultivated, nurtured. Buddhism teaches that the world we experience isn't merely made up of what happens to us, but how our mind interprets it. A peaceful mind can walk through chaos and remain undisturbed. An agitated mind will suffer, even in paradise. There's an old Zen saying, you should sit in meditation for 20 minutes a day unless you're too busy. Then you should sit for an hour. It's clever, but it's also deeply true, because the more frantic our outer world becomes, the more vital it is to find stillness inside. Now you might be thinking, but life is stressful, work is demanding, people are difficult, the world is unpredictable. How can anyone stay peaceful in a place like this? And the answer is, you don't have to change the world. You only need to understand your mind. Most of our suffering doesn't come from events themselves, but from the stories we attach to them. We lose a job, and instead of seeing it as a new beginning, we tell ourselves we're a failure. A loved one leaves and we believe we're unlovable. Plans fall apart and we convince ourselves life is unfair. The Buddha called this the second arrow. The first arrow is the event itself, unavoidable, a part of being alive. The second arrow is the mental anguish we inflict upon ourselves in response to it. And that's the arrow we can learn to stop shooting. Imagine for a moment a life where your peace isn't held hostage by circumstances, where you can face challenges without crumbling, where joy isn't something rare and fleeting, but a natural undercurrent running quietly through everything you do. That life exists, and it doesn't begin by fixing everything around you. It begins by tending to what's within you. The journey to a peaceful life starts with a peaceful mind. But how do we find it? What keeps pulling us into restlessness and unease? And how can we unlearn the patterns that keep us stuck in cycles of stress and discontent? In the teachings of the Buddha, there's a profound understanding of the mind's nature, why it suffers, how it clings, and how it can be freed. And it isn't through escape, or numbing, or chasing after temporary pleasures. It's through awareness, through wisdom, through compassion for ourselves and for others. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the ancient wisdom that's as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. We'll uncover the roots of inner turmoil and learn the art of letting go. We'll discover practices not only for monks in mountain monasteries, but for people like you and me, living in the middle of noise, deadlines, and daily demands. And as we move through this journey together, you might begin to realize something beautiful. The peace you've been seeking was never lost. It was quietly waiting, underneath all the noise, patiently calling you home. So take a breath. Let the weight of this moment settle. And when you're ready, let's step a little deeper into the heart of it. Because the real freedom isn't found in what you can escape from, but in what you can be fully present for. And that presence, that deep, unshakable peace, begins right here. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing in the middle of a crowded street, cars honking, people rushing past, 100 voices, 1,000 distractions, but the real noise isn't out there. It's inside your head, endless thoughts, old memories resurfacing when you least expect them, worries about things you can't control, an inner dialogue that never stops narrating, analyzing, judging. It feels like a constant tug-of-war, doesn't it? One part of you longs for peace. Another part keeps dragging you back into restlessness. But why? Why do we carry this invisible tension, even when everything around us seems fine? Why do moments of calm feel so rare and so easily shattered? To understand this, we need to go deeper. Because what disturbs us most isn't life itself. It's how our mind interprets it. Buddhism describes the human mind as a restless monkey, always jumping from one branch to another, chasing pleasure, fleeing discomfort, clinging to the past, worrying about the future. It can't sit still. And in that constant movement, it creates endless stories that shape how we see the world, how we feel about ourselves, and how we respond to life. The root of inner turmoil lies in these three tendencies: craving, aversion, and ignorance. The Buddha called them the three poisons because they quietly poison the mind, keeping us trapped in cycles of suffering. Craving is that endless hunger for more success, more love, more comfort. It's the thought, I'll be happy when. But the moment we get what we chased, the satisfaction fades, and we start chasing the next thing. Aversion is the instinct to push away what we dislike. Pain, loss, failure, difficult people. We fight against reality, wishing things were different. But resistance only makes the suffering heavier. And ignorance, perhaps the most dangerous of the three, is our blindness to the true nature of things. We believe things are permanent when they're not. We mistake temporary feelings for lasting truths. We chase illusions, not seeing the quiet, constant impermanence that flows through all of life. These three poisons feed the storm within us. A difficult conversation happens, craving makes us wish for approval, aversion makes us resent discomfort, ignorance keeps us blind to the impermanence of the moment. A plan falls apart, and instead of adapting, we cling to how it should have been. A loved one disappoints us, and instead of understanding, we let resentment take root. In every moment of inner unrest, one of these poisons is at work. But here's the hopeful part. They're not your natural state. They're learned habits, patterns of mind that with awareness and practice can be untangled. Because the mind, though restless by nature, is also trainable. And once we recognize what fuels our suffering, we can stop feeding it. You see, most of us live reacting to the world, rather than responding with clarity. A thought appears, we believe it. An emotion rises, we act on it. A situation unfolds, we cling or resist or run. But there's a space, a sacred pause between what happens and how we choose to meet it. The Buddha taught that in that tiny gap lies our freedom. The ability to observe, to understand, to choose a different response. Not by suppressing emotions, not by pretending life is always beautiful and easy, but by seeing clearly the nature of craving, aversion, and ignorance when they arise, and gently letting them pass. Imagine a stormy sky. The clouds are heavy, the winds wild, but above it all, the sky itself remains untouched, vast, and unbroken. Your awareness is like that sky. The thoughts and emotions just passing weather. The ancient masters spoke of this often. That suffering isn't found in the pain itself, but in the clinging, the resistance, the stories we attach to it. A monk once said, "The waves are always there. You cannot stop them, but you can learn to surf." Understanding the root of your inner turmoil doesn't mean your life will become free of difficulties. It means those difficulties will no longer own you. You'll begin to notice the cravings when they appear. Recognize the aversion rising in your chest. Spot the ignorance in your assumptions. And in that awareness, a new kind of peace takes root. Not the fragile, temporary peace that depends on circumstances, but a steady, grounded calm that lives beneath the noise. The Buddhists call this mindfulness, the art of remembering to remember, to be present, to notice what arises, and to gently let go. In the next part of our journey, we won't speak of theories alone. We'll step into the practices, the simple, powerful ways ancient wisdom offers us to calm the storm and return to the stillness of the sky within. Because once you understand the source of the storm, you no longer fear the wind. And when that happens, peace is no longer something you have to chase. It becomes something you carry with you. Somewhere along the winding path of life, we begin to realize peace isn't something the world hands to us. It isn't found in the next promotion, the next relationship, the perfect vacation, or a flawless day. No, peace is an inside job. And if we want to reclaim it, we need to know how to tend the mind, the way a gardener tends a fragile, beautiful garden. And no one understood this better than the Buddha. For over 2,500 years, Buddhist wisdom has whispered one timeless truth to those willing to listen. The quality of your mind determines the quality of your life. It's not your circumstances. It's not your possessions. It's the stories you believe, the emotions you cling to, and the patterns you feed. The Buddhist way to a peaceful mind isn't a philosophy you recite, it's a practice you live. And it begins with one thing: awareness. In Buddhist teaching, they call it sati, mindfulness. Not a trendy buzzword or a 5-minute breathing app, but a way of being. A steady, gentle noticing of what arises within you, moment by moment, without judgment. Because you cannot change what you refuse to see. When anger flares, you notice it. When craving tugs at you, you name it. When fear whispers, you hear it. You don't suppress it. You don't chase it. You simply see it. And in that clarity, the mind begins to untangle itself. But mindfulness alone isn't enough. Because a peaceful mind isn't just free of chaos, it's also rich in qualities that nourish the heart. The Buddha spoke of cultivating what he called the 4 immeasurables, mental states so vast and boundless they transform the way we experience the world. Loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity. Imagine waking up every day with a heart inclined toward kindness. Not because others deserve it, but because your own peace matters. Imagine meeting suffering in yourself or others, not with resistance, but with a tender compassion, like a mother tending a child's scraped knee. Imagine celebrating others' happiness instead of envying it, and holding steady through life's storms, neither clinging to pleasure nor crumbling in pain. These qualities don't just happen, they're trained. Like muscles, like skills, like sacred habits of mind. And it happens through practice. Simple, quiet, radical practices. Meditation is one, not the image of a monk on a mountain untouched by the world, but a moment you claim for yourself, sitting, breathing, watching the thoughts rise and fall like waves. No need to stop them, no need to chase calm, just observe. And slowly the mind begins to soften, like muddy water settling when left undisturbed. But Buddhism teaches that peace isn't built only in stillness. It's forged in how we live, how we speak, how we act. That's why the Buddha offered the Noble Eightfold Path, a practical, compassionate guide for living in a way that leads to peace. Not through perfection, not by renouncing the world, but by bringing wisdom, kindness, and awareness to the ordinary moments of your day. Right view, seeing things as they truly are, not as your fears or desires paint them. Right intention, choosing motivations rooted in kindness, not craving or aversion. Right speech, words that heal, not harm, truth spoken gently, silence when needed. Right action, conduct guided by compassion, avoiding harm, fostering goodness. Right livelihood, earning your living in a way that doesn't exploit or cause suffering. Right effort, nurturing wholesome states of mind, releasing the unwholesome. Right mindfulness, the steady remembering to be here, now, fully. Right concentration, cultivating the ability to focus the mind, to steady the heart. Notice, this isn't a doctrine to believe, it's a path to walk. Each step dissolves a little more restlessness. Each mindful breath releases a bit more of the weight you've carried for years. The Buddhist way to a peaceful mind isn't about avoiding life's storms. It's about learning to move through them with grace. Not untouched by pain, but unshaken by it. You realize the waves will come, but you're no longer at their mercy. You recognize that craving rises, but you don't have to follow it. You feel anger flicker, but you can meet it with wisdom. And in this, peace stops being a distant hope or a lucky accident. It becomes a natural, steady presence, the way the sky exists, even behind the clouds. It's not the absence of difficulty, it's the presence of clarity. And clarity is what frees us. As we continue this journey, you'll discover that this path isn't for saints alone. It's for you, for the restless student, the anxious parent, the heartbroken lover, the overworked soul, for anyone willing to trade chasing peace for becoming peace. And now, let's take this wisdom off the page and into your hands. In the next part of our journey, we'll uncover the art of letting go, how to release the invisible weights we carry, and why true peace isn't something you add to your life, but something you find when you let go of what's never been yours to hold. Because peace isn't about getting more, it's about carrying less. And trust me, once you taste it, you'll never settle for anything less. There's a quiet truth we all sense, even if we rarely say it out loud. Much of our inner turmoil isn't born from what the world does to us, but from what we do to ourselves. The restless mind, the gnawing guilt, the uneasy sleep, they aren't just accidents of fate. They're the echoes of choices, the aftermath of actions taken without alignment. Because deep down, we all crave a life that feels clean. Not in the sense of flawless perfection, but in the sense of integrity. A way of moving through this world that lets you lay your head down at night without regret gnawing at the corners of your peace. And the Buddha understood this better than anyone. He taught that inner peace isn't just a matter of meditation and mindfulness. It's forged in the way we live, moment by moment. In our choices, our words, our work, our relationships. Because a mind at war with its own actions will never be at peace. This is why ethical living is a cornerstone of the Buddhist path, not as a rigid list of rules, but as a compass that gently points us toward peace. A way of untangling the knots in our hearts by aligning our behavior with our deeper values. The Buddha offered what's known as the 5 precepts, simple yet profound guidelines for ethical living. Not to punish, not to restrict, but to protect our own peace. The first, refrain from taking life, not just in the literal sense, but in how we treat the fragile existence around us. Every act of kindness toward life nourishes our own sense of connection, while every careless harm chips away at it. The second, refrain from taking what is not given. Not just stealing in the obvious sense, but taking advantage, exploiting, or claiming what isn't ours to claim. Because nothing disturbs the heart like dishonesty, and no possession is worth the cost of your inner peace. The third, refrain from sexual misconduct. Not as a moral judgment, but as a call to be mindful of how our desires, unchecked, can wound others and ourselves. When our relationships are built on respect, honesty, and care, the heart remains unburdened. The fourth, refrain from false speech, because words shape worlds. A careless lie, a cruel remark, a reckless promise, these are the seeds of unrest. But words spoken with truth and compassion become a sanctuary for others and for ourselves. The fifth, refrain from intoxicants that cloud the mind. Not as a blanket rule, but as an invitation to remain clear, awake, and capable of meeting life with presence. At first glance, these might seem simple, but in truth, they are radical acts of self-love. Each one a choice to protect your own peace from the inside out. And here's the wisdom most people miss. Living ethically isn't about being perfect. It's about noticing when you fall out of alignment and gently, without shame, returning. It's about asking yourself in small, quiet moments, is this choice leading me toward peace or away from it? Because every action leaves an imprint. On the world, on others, and most deeply on yourself. In Buddhist philosophy, this is called karma, the natural law of cause and effect. Not a cosmic punishment system, but a reflection of how our actions inevitably shape the quality of our inner world. Lie and you carry the tension of deceit. Steal and you inherit the fear of being exposed. Harm others and the wound lives in your own heart. But live with integrity and the mind begins to settle. A quiet confidence arises. You no longer have to run from yourself. And when you combine this with mindfulness, when you see your intentions clearly and choose actions that reflect your highest self, a peace stops being a theory. It becomes your lived experience. And the beauty of this is, ethical living isn't limited to monasteries or saints. It's for busy parents, office workers, students, artists, neighbors, for anyone willing to ask, what kind of person do I want to be when no one's watching? Because true peace isn't awarded to those who meditate the longest or chant the loudest. It belongs to those who live in harmony with their own hearts. When your actions, your words, and your intentions align, the mind grows quiet, guilt fades, shame softens, and what's left is a spaciousness where peace can finally take root. And this is where the journey gets beautiful. Because as you live ethically, you become a refuge for yourself. And without even trying, you become a refuge for others. You'll notice the way people relax around you, how trust builds, how conversations deepen, and how even in a noisy, restless world, you become an island of calm. This is the silent magic of ethical living. Not as a duty, but as a gift you give yourself, one mindful, compassionate choice at a time. And now, as we continue down this path, there's one final piece to uncover. Because while ethics and mindfulness clear the ground, and compassion waters the heart, there's one force that holds it all together: wisdom. Not the kind found in books, but the wisdom of seeing reality as it truly is, of recognizing what causes suffering, what leads to peace, and having the courage to choose the path that frees you. And that's where we'll go next. Because a peaceful mind isn't a fragile thing, it's a fearless one. And you're ready for that. Close your eyes for a moment, take a deep breath, and feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest. You might think this breath belongs to me, but trace it back and you'll see. That breath was made possible by 1,000 unseen hands. The trees that released the oxygen, the clouds that brought the rain to nourish those trees, the sun that warmed the soil, the farmer who planted the seed, the earth that cradled the roots. That one simple breath is not yours alone. It's a gift, born from the entire universe conspiring in quiet harmony. And here lies one of the deepest truths Buddhism has to offer: interbeing. A word coined by the beloved Zen master, Thich Nhat Hanh, to describe the reality that nothing exists independently. You are not separate from the world around you. Your joys, your sorrows, your hopes, your fears, they don't rise in isolation. They're woven from the threads of everything and everyone you've ever touched, and everything that has ever touched you. When a person smiles at you on a hard day, you feel lighter. When someone's harsh words land, you carry their weight. And likewise, your words, your actions, your presence, they ripple outward, shaping lives you'll never even meet. In truth, there's no such thing as a private act. Every thought you nurture, every word you utter, every choice you make, becomes part of the great unfolding tapestry of existence. This isn't some abstract philosophy. You felt it. In the warmth of a stranger's kindness, in the ache of another's suffering, in the way a single act of compassion can soften an entire room. Buddha taught this interdependence in countless ways. He spoke of the rain that feeds the crops, of the sun that ripens the fruit, of the soil that cradles the seed, of the countless beings, seen and unseen, who make life possible. And this understanding isn't meant to overwhelm us. It's meant to wake us up, to see that our peace and the peace of others are intertwined, that no one truly suffers alone, and no one truly heals alone. It's why compassion isn't a virtue in Buddhism, it's a necessity. Because when you harm another, you inevitably harm yourself. And when you ease the pain of another, your own heart grows lighter. It's not sentimental, it's physics. the law of interconnected hearts. And once you see this, you start living differently. You become slower to judge, quicker to forgive, more generous with your kindness, not because you're trying to be a good person, but because you've realized you are them, and they are you. That cashier you brushed past, she's someone's mother, someone's child. The man you resented in traffic, he carries grief you'll never see. And when you act with this awareness, peace stops being a personal goal. It becomes a collective reality. Because you begin to notice. When you offer gentleness to the world, you experience gentleness within. When you plant seeds of patience, calm grows in your own mind. And when you stop chasing only your own happiness, you discover a deeper joy than you ever knew existed. In Buddhist practice, this insight blossoms through meditation, a practice of cultivating loving kindness. You begin by sending goodwill to yourself, then to a loved one, then to a stranger, then even to someone who's hurt you, and finally to all beings everywhere, not as a performance, but as a remembering that we rise and fall together. And here's what's truly beautiful about this practice. You don't have to be a monk on a mountain. You don't need perfect focus or saintly patience. You just need the willingness to open your heart, one moment at a time. To see the grocery clerk not as a transaction, but as a fellow traveler in this fragile, beautiful world. To see the man sleeping on the street as someone whose suffering belongs to all of us. To look at your own reflection and offer kindness, even when you fall short. This is interbeing made real. And it's here in these quiet, ordinary moments that peace takes root. Because when you live as though nothing is separate, loneliness dissolves, isolation crumbles, and even in your hardest hours, you feel held by something greater than yourself. A vast, invisible web of connection, of shared breath, shared tears, shared hopes. And from this place, your actions naturally begin to change. You speak with more care. You give with fewer conditions. You forgive more easily, not because people always deserve it, but because you deserve peace. And so does everyone else. This is not a naive way of living. It's a fearless one. Because to truly see yourself in others means opening yourself to their suffering, their joy, their humanity. But it also means you're never truly alone again. Not in grief, not in joy, not in the silence between. And this quiet, steady awareness of our deep, unbreakable connection is one of the surest paths to a peaceful mind. Not as an escape from the world, but as a way of fully belonging to it. Now, as this understanding settles, one more truth emerges. If everything is connected, then the way you treat your own mind matters not just for you, but for all beings. And the practice of mindfulness, tending to your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions becomes an act of service, a way to cleanse the stream that flows through you and into the world. And that's where our journey leads next. Because inner peace isn't a passive state, it's a courageous daily choice, and mindfulness is the key. Let's step into that together. There's a beautiful old saying in Zen, a journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath your feet. It's a quiet reminder that peace isn't a distant mountaintop we must climb to reach. It's right here, waiting in the rhythm of our ordinary days. In the way we wake, the way we breathe, the way we speak, and the way we touch the lives around us. Most of us imagine peace as something grand. A silent retreat in the Himalayas. A rare moment of escape from the chaos of our busy lives. But the wisdom of Buddhism tells us something different. That peace isn't found in the absence of noise, it's discovered in the way we meet each moment. And how do we meet it? Through simple, mindful practices, small, sacred rituals, the kind that don't require special robes or ancient mantras, only a heart willing to pay attention. So let's step gently into these daily practices, the ones that quietly, steadily build a peaceful life from a peaceful mind. First, begin your mornings in silence, before reaching for your phone, before checking the world's noise. Simply sit, feel your breath, notice the quietness before the day awakens. Even 5 minutes can change the shape of your entire day. In those few sacred moments, set a quiet intention. Today, I choose peace. And if peace feels too far away, whisper, "Today, I will be kind to myself." Second, practice mindful breathing. It sounds so simple, almost too simple, but the breath is your anchor in the storm. No matter where you are, what chaos surrounds you, your breath is always there, rising, falling, a quiet witness to it all. Throughout the day, pause. Take 3 deep, conscious breaths. In, out, feel it. No need to force anything. Just notice. This one small act pulls you out of automatic reaction and plants you gently back into the present. Third, savor simple rituals. The way you make tea, the warmth of water on your hands as you wash a dish, the sound of evening rain tapping against your window. Zen Buddhism teaches us that enlightenment is found in ordinary things. The problem is never the task, it's the way we rush through it, never truly present. So the next time you eat with awareness. Notice the colors, the textures, the scent. Feel gratitude for all the lives that made this meal possible. The farmer, the earth, the sun, the rain. In these small moments, you step out of time and into life's sacred rhythm. Fourth, speak with mindfulness. Our words are seeds. Every sentence we offer plants something in the heart of another, peace or agitation, hope or fear. Before you speak, ask, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? It's not about being perfect. It's about being conscious. Because in a single careless word we can bruise a soul, and in a single tender word we can heal one. Fifth, embrace stillness at day's end. As evening falls, create a ritual of closure. Light a candle, sit in the dark for a moment. Let the noise of the day settle like dust. Reflect without judgment. Where did I meet peace today? Where did I lose it? Not to punish yourself, but to gently learn. This soft accounting keeps you awake to your own life. Sixth, practice metta, loving kindness. As you lie in bed before sleep claims you, offer silent wishes. May I be peaceful. May I be safe. May I be free from suffering. Then extend it outward, to someone you love, to a stranger, to someone difficult, to all beings everywhere. This isn't about magic, it's about reshaping your heart. Turning it each night towards softness until compassion becomes your natural resting place. Seventh, be a guardian of your own mind. In Buddhism, they say, the mind is like a garden. If you don't tend it, weeds will grow. Watch the thoughts you water. Are they seeds of worry, resentment, fear, or seeds of peace, patience, kindness? No thought is harmless. Each one shapes your inner weather. So be vigilant, not with harshness, but with gentle awareness. When you catch yourself lost in anger, return to your breath. When you spiral into anxiety, name it. Say softly, this is worry. Naming it brings space. And in that space, you remember you are not your thoughts. Lastly, remember peace is a practice, not a finish line, not a reward for the disciplined few. It's a path you walk and stumble from and return to 100 times a day. And each time you return, you grow stronger. Each time you choose gentleness over judgment, you untangle another knot in your heart. Buddha never promised a life without suffering. He promised a way to meet suffering with a peaceful mind. And these small daily acts, the breath, the silence, the kindness, the awareness, they are the tools, the lamps you carry through the dark. And over time, something begins to shift. The storms still come, but you don't drown. The noise still rises, but you know the way back to silence. You realize peace was never something to find. It was something to remember, a home you carry within. And so, our journey brings us here, to a simple, beautiful truth, that you already have everything you need to live a peaceful life. You always did. And as we near the final chapter of this path, there's one last invitation, to look back, gather what you've learned and carry it into a life of meaning, courage, and quiet joy. Because peace isn't a dream, it's your birthright, and now it's time to claim it. And so here we are, not at an ending, but at a beginning. Because the real journey isn't the one you watch in videos or read in books or even hear in whispered words from ancient masters. It's the quiet one that unfolds inside you. The truth is, every wisdom shared, every practice offered, every story told, they've all been gentle reminders pointing to one simple, undeniable truth. The peace you've been searching for has always lived within you. Not in the perfect job, not in the flawless relationship, not in the absence of struggle, but in the way you meet each breath, in the kindness you offer yourself, in the moments you choose presence over distraction, and compassion over judgment. This journey, your journey, is a path you walk alone. And yet, you are never truly alone, because every being you meet along the way is a mirror, reflecting your fears, your hopes, your light. And when you begin to see this, when you begin to feel it in your bones, the quiet, unshakable knowing that you and the world are not two, that's where peace begins to bloom quietly, like a lotus rising from muddy waters. Buddha once said, "If you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your own path." And perhaps that's the most sacred thing we can do in this life. Tend to our own hearts. Then gently let that light spill out, touching others, not through grand gestures, but through ordinary, unnoticed kindness. A smile you didn't have to give, a moment you chose to listen instead of speak, a silent blessing you offered a stranger in passing. That is how the world changes, not overnight, but heart by heart. And remember, this path isn't about perfection, it's about presence. You'll stumble, you'll forget. You'll get lost in old fears and restless worries. But the beautiful thing is you can always begin again. Right here, right now, with this breath. Because every day is a chance to return home to yourself. And if this journey we've shared together in these chapters has touched a quiet corner of your heart, if it's reminded you, even for a moment, of who you truly are beneath all the noise, then let's continue walking this path, side by side. If you found peace in these words, if something here spoke to your soul, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel for more quiet wisdom, for more journeys like this one. Your presence here matters, your peace matters, and together we can create a little more calm in this restless world. So take a deep breath, smile softly to yourself, and as you step back into your life, carry this truth with you. The journey to a peaceful life always begins from within. And you, my friend, you are already on your way.